After suffering injuries from an IED explosion, what was the biggest hurdle you overcame in your recovery?
It is hard to tell because there were a lot of hurdles and you had to clear some of them more than once. But the biggest thing is wrapping your head around the enormity of what you're facing, I suppose. The doctors told me my recovery would take a year and a half to 2 years. The reality is it took more like 5 to 6 years. And actually 10 years later, you realize that you're never recovered. I will never have the physical ability that I used to. It's not to say that I can't be fit. It's not to say that I can't challenge myself, but I will never do things in the way that I used to. And so you'll never be fully recovered. And that is both a physical challenge, but also a mental challenge to be able to adjust and accept that. And accepting things like going from being fiercely independent in the Marines to now being quite dependent on others. And that's not a bad thing. There's a positive to be learned about, appreciating the support networks you have and having people to rely on. But it was, losing your independence is a terrifying thing, and it's a really hard thing to adjust to. So I think the biggest thing was just trying to adjust to the enormity of the challenge and the fact that, the repercussions of what I sustained will live with me forever.
And so following that, from your recovery, how did you ensure your mental health and well-being?
Amazingly, with my mental health, I just happened, I think, to do the right things. When I look at the points in my recovery where things could have gone, terribly wrong with my mental health, I think by accident did the right things. And that was mainly through my openness and my honesty, my ability to vocalize what I was seeing, how I was struggling, not even necessarily ask for help, but just say it to people in a manner where they could offer help or they could at least just listen. And that burden was taken off of me. And again, no one really told me to do that. And it wasn't even that I was doing it with even necessarily with a trained professional. It was more that just not letting things build up within myself, being open, being honest with others, and therefore being honest with myself. That, when I look back at it, was what has steered me away from some of the catastrophic outcomes that sadly some of my friends have suffered from, are suffering with. But it's not to say that I always get it right, and it's not to say that it was easy, but I do count myself lucky, not that it didn't happen to me, but rather that I just managed to avert it through unintentional means, essentially.
Definitely. And I think during times of crisis or during times of hardship, it can be so difficult to talk to people, I think, especially for men who struggle to have that conversation. Did the experience teach you anything about the importance of opening up and why it's important for men, especially, to open up?
Yeah, I mean, I come, the Marines especially, from a very sort of alpha male, masculine culture where it's tricky because we were very determined, very independent, and sort of, we cracked on and we bottled it up. But actually, we came from an environment, and essentially, especially when, the worst does happen and your life is saved by those around you, and you basically surrender yourself to vulnerability in that, because you have no other choice, then you suddenly realize how dependent you are on others anyway, and always have been. You're not doing this alone. You never were. And actually, what's the point in doing anything alone? As far as I'm concerned, that's pretty boring. I'd rather do it with others and with the help of others. And so it definitely gave me a mindset shift. And then also I found myself in recovery, surrounded by mainly guys going through the same experiences. And that meant that, for want of a better phrase, we could cut the BS. We could all just drop the act. And, we didn't have to pretend to be tough guys, I suppose, because we'd all survived a bomb blast. So, that's a given. But rather, we were happy to just be honest with each other and put our arm around each other as and when we needed it, because we all knew that we would have bad days. Of course you would. We were coming from the worst of circumstances. So yeah, it was a big it was a big eye-opener for me. And one of the most difficult things, I suppose, is that actually for ordinary folks, they're not. I was exposed to such a huge degree of hardship in one big sitting in particular that you had no choice but to realize something about yourself, develop as a person. Most of the victories, most of the failures that people experience on a day-to-day basis, they don't register up. And so therefore they don't learn from them. But they do build up, particularly the failures. And if you're not willing to talk about them, be honest about them, that's when it ends up with a catastrophic outcome. And I suppose the only other thing I would say as well is that, you know, and it's a pretty well-known phrase now, but we all have mental health, whether it's good or bad, whether you look after it is the other thing. And I'm learning more than ever that you should have a positive mental health. You know, we all look after our bodies. We did that in the Marines all the time. That was where we were proud of the physical hardness that we had. But actually, imagine we were tuning our brains in on the same way and we were looking after it in the same way. Then actually you could unlock that extra 10%. And I think that positive mental health thing is really important, because we should stop looking after our mental health as a last resort and we should start having an active input into it.
Definitely. Fantastic answer. And it's really encouraging to hear you talk about mental health in such a way, especially mentioning the differences between big hardships and little stresses, because I think you're right, we are drip fed these little stresses in life, and we have those doubts in our head where we think, oh, it's not that bad, I can deal with it, people have gone through worse, and that just builds up on you.
Yeah, that is it. It's, you know, if you want to put it in sort of military terms, people think about experiencing one big trauma as the thing that leads to, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder or, you know, ill mental health. But actually, in just the same manner, exposure to, you know, extremes just creeping in on a daily basis has the same outcome. Now, that's it in the extreme environment which I once inhabited 10 years ago. But actually, that happens on the day-to-day in the real world. We experience stresses, particularly when it's things like family or work. And those stresses absolutely build up, but we don't see it happening because we write it off as, that's life. Now, there has to be a balance in that. Sometimes you have to, you know, suck it up and get on with doing things which you don't necessarily enjoy, but there is a cracking point at which that becomes very unhealthy. And if you put that on top of not looking after your mental health, so things like overworking, not getting enough sleep, not looking after your well-being, then it's a recipe for disaster, essentially. And you know, that will come round, and it will attack you with terrible consequence if you don't look after yourself, for want of a better word. And that is physically, mentally, and also socially. Like, it's important that you have your releases and your outputs and your support network, and but you know, you have a balance between life and work, which I'll admit I don't always get right myself.